Wondering which legendary dragons are going to be the best legendary dragons in Descent of Dragons?
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Well, I got dragons in this video. You get a dragon, you get a dragon, you get a dragon. And in fact, 10 legendary dragons were revealed for Descent of Dragons. They're all playable starting tomorrow. And I wanted to lock in my ratings here for the very best legendary dragons and the very worst. And I'm going to tell you now, this is a really tough list to sort out. I'm really only confident in my top 2 picks. Everything else could move like 3 positions, and I'd be like, okay, fine. So we're going to start off here with the worst legendary dragon, and I don't even think it's that bad, right? It's USERRA Unleashed for Druid. This is a 9-mana 4/12 dragon, like the original USERRA. You get some Dream Portals in your deck when you play this one. And the reason I'm ranking this one at the bottom is purely because of a speed issue with this card. When you play this, sometimes it takes a long time for it to actually pay off because you shuffle those Dream Portals into your deck and maybe you don't see them for like 3 or 4 turns. If you do see them for 3 or 4 turns, it's probably because you're committing a lot of card draw, which means you're maybe not playing for other things on board, which by the time you get to turn 9, you need to start doing things. You need to start moving towards end-game state. And even like in the best case scenario where you play this with a totally empty deck and then draw like 7 dragons the next turn and they all get summoned, it's like a worse Chef Nomi, and frankly, the dragons can be pretty inconsistent in their sizes. You might get some 3/2s and some 12/12s, and it's hard to predict exactly what you're going to get in any given scenario, which makes it an unreliable card at that. So it's a little slow, it's a little inconsistent, unpredictable. All of those things make, to me, USERRA Unleashed, although probably a fine card, I think the weakest of the legendary dragons. Next up here, MAREZ the Infinite, and this guy will play all cards your opponent played last turn. Now, one thing to note is that he will not replay their battle cries, much like Test Greymane. It would just play the minion, not the battle cry of the minion. So one limitation there right away, given how many battle cry cards there are in Hearthstone. And beyond that, there's just some awkwardness with this card, I think, where I've explained this many times before. He is doing the same thing as your opponent, and often in Hearthstone, you kind of like to do the opposite thing of your opponent. What I mean by that is if your opponent plays like 3 big minions, often it's not very good to just play 3 big minions in return because your opponent can then use those minions to dictate favorable trades or just go face or play buffs on those minions. You're kind of passing initiative to your opponent when you match them. Now, you do get an 8/8 on the board extra, right? But if they're just killing you with 3 big minions, who cares? You need to play a removal spell. When they play big minions, you don't just need to counter with big minions. And alternatively, if they play a big removal spell, MAREZ's not going to do much with a removal spell either. So finding this moment where everything is perfect and you can actually just match your opponent and toss in an 8/8, I think becomes rather awkward. So for me here with MAREZ, it's just a big commitment from a mana cost standpoint, and the extra 8/8 body isn't necessarily worth it. And, you know, there's maybe like 1 in 5 turns where you're like, okay, this is a pretty good MAREZ turn. And otherwise, it's just kind of sitting in your hand. And I don't know if that's going to be enough in a class like Priest that often just needs to be very reactive and kind of respect the game straight up. They can't really do too many crazy shenanigans like this one. So for me, MAREZ falls a little short. Moving on here to Nozdormu the Timeless. This is our new Paladin Dragon Legendary, and he is a 4-mana 8/8. That's a big old boy, setting each player's mana to 10 when you play him. Now, it's noteworthy that you do not immediately get 6 additional mana from Nozdormu, but you do pass the turn to your opponent who has the full 10 mana. So they're actually taking a benefit from Nozdormu before you, which is really the limitation for this card and why I think he's ranking much farther down on this list than some might expect. It turns out giving your opponent 10 mana is a big problem. Even in things like aggro decks, they can just dump the board and go crazy on you. Other control decks certainly going to have other ways to play a lot of big things. And it's going to be hard for a Paladin to build a deck that's big enough to take advantage of this mana more than their opponent. And that's the real challenge here for Nozdormu, is how big can a big Paladin be, and is that big enough? So far, in my experience with playing this a little bit, I don't think so. It seems like the opponent always seems to get the best of Nozdormu before you do, and that's just going to make him a problem to run, even though he is a 4-mana 8/8. That extra, say, like, you know, 3-3 in stats or whatever it is, or even 4-3 in stats, isn't really worth giving your opponent such a big mana swing. So unfortunately, Noz, I got to put you fairly far down on this list. So next up here we have Nithog, and this is a fair bit higher on the list than I expected it to be. I'll be honest. If I had made this list right after all the reveals came out, I probably would have put this guy last. But after playing against him, I think Nithog is like sort of okay. I still don't love him. I think ultimately when you look at the full reward on this card, it's not that much better than other cards in Hearthstone. It doesn't feel like it stands out over things like USERRA, for instance, just given the higher cost and the delay on the rush minions. There's some awkwardness there, but at the same time, that awkwardness does contribute a little bit of extra value to this card because it kind of splits up your pressure, which can be nice for a class like Shaman who just needs sticky minions on board. And this guy does just summon 3 sticky minions, and that's kind of a high friction play that some decks and classes don't really want to deal with. I don't think the payoff is particularly high because those 4/4s can't attack face, right? They can trade into the board, but it's not like they're setting up any kind of lethal pressures or anything. But it's still a little better than I expected. And I don't think it's going to be a great card. I don't think it's going to, pop into every Shaman deck by any means, but there might be a deck out there that can squeeze this in just because Shaman likes wide boards, they like minions on board, they like battle cries. So between all 3 of those things, Nithog can maybe find a home, and that's why he's, for me at least, surprisingly high on this list. Moving on here to Waxy Dread, the Rogue Dragon. Has a pretty fun death rattle here. You shuffle a candle into your deck, and then anytime you draw that candle, you re-summon Waxy Dread. So a little bit like USERRA Unleashed in a way, where we've got some dragons coming out of your deck, basically. But the one cool thing about Waxy Dread over USERRA is that he's 5 mana, first off, so you can get him down much, much sooner in the game, and you always know what your result is going to be. Now, it's less likely to draw the candle on any given turn, right? Because USERRA is 7 and this is only 1, but there are ways to cheat out that candle. There's a handful of new cards that can help you get either more Waxy Dreads in the pool, or just like Stowaway will draw you the candle outright to potentially keep pushing more and more Waxy Dreads on board. The challenge for this card is going to be the fact that Rogue is a class which typically can't take a long time to initiate game plans. They kind of need to go, go, go. And Waxy Dread might be a little slow for Rogue, even if you build the deck specifically. Is there enough survivability? Is there enough healing? Can Rogue play long enough to get enough candles to make this guy worth it? Because as a 5-mana play, he's certainly okay, but not super exciting in his own right. But I still think Rogue can get there at some level. It doesn't have to be a dragon deck, but a Death Rattle synergy deck of some sort might make Waxy Dread, the kind of tier 3 deck option. And compared to the other dragons on this list, that's actually not too bad. So up next here is Zaku the Warped for Warlock, and this guy, anytime you take damage, he's going to summon you a 6/6, and initially I thought this card was a little more awkward than it seemed in practice. I got to play this a little bit in the theory crafting and had people play it against me as well, and it turned out there were many instances where it felt like we had time to play this and even get a 6/6 or 2 out of it to create some late game pressure that often even won me games. So I'm a little higher on Zaku than I expected. Now, of course, as we get into the real Hearthstone meta, things can get pretty aggressive and crazy, and there may not be time to play Zaku. But against slower decks, this guy created some real friction and some legitimate problems, and potential to scale long term as well. And the game definitely seemed to warp around Zaku the Warped whenever he got played, which I think is pretty powerful. Like, your opponent has to dedicate resources to it. You're often getting a 6/6 to boot, so you don't feel that bad even if they kill Zaku. You eat premium removal, and they don't deal with it. There's problems because you might get 3 or 4 6/6s, and that created some dilemmas for aggro decks who were trying to kill us, and even created dilemmas for control decks too. So all in all, Zaku felt much better than I dreamed. And I think there's an option for like a handlock style Warlock, any kind of late game Warlock deck, to squeeze in a Zaku. In particular, just because you need to power cards like Nether Breath. That's just such a good card that you gotta have dragons, and Zaku might be one of the better dragons for Warlock. So he may just get a pass based on other great cards like that Netherwing and Nether Breath. So Zaku the Warped, I think, is gonna get some play. Next up here, we have Varanus for Hunter, and although I haven't really played or seen this one played a lot, I still just have good feelings about it. We have seen some dragon support cards come in for Hunter that are pretty powerful. Corrosive Breath and the new Eagle Horn Bow for dragons both look like they could do some cool things if a dragon deck took off. But I don't even think Varanus really demands a dragon deck. I think because of this effect and the ability it serves to swing boards in any kind of Hunter deck that's running either like Desert Spear or Spring Paws, it just seems like a really good mid-game option. Drop Varanus with your Desert Spear and you're really happy. You killed a couple things and you got a pretty threatening body on board for 6 mana. And with things like Highlander Hunters out there that just need to include good cards in their list, it certainly to me feels like Varanus is gonna make the cut in a Highlander Hunter deck. It just feels like too good of an effect and too good of a minion. So I'm like just betting on Highlander Hunter being a thing and Varanus just fitting right into that deck. If Dragon Hunter comes along and works out eventually too, that's just bonus points for Varanus seeing some potential play in my mind, but it's certainly not the basis for my rating on this card. He just looks like a really good minion in a class that, although maybe doesn't always play towards, control-y type 6-drops, this certainly still fits in, and even in an aggressive deck, this could be a top-end card to help you push through some taunts. We saw like Equality run in aggro decks back in the day, and Varanus could do the same sort of thing. So I'm still pretty high on this card, but without a lot of experience to back that up so far. Moving on here to the top 3, we got Deathwing Mad Aspect. This is another card I've only played a little, but every time I played it, it felt really good. And I still think it makes a lot of sense inherently when I break this card down. He's a 12/12, of course, and his battle cry will force him to attack all other minions. Now, what that means is a couple things potentially, right? Deathwing can just be an 8-mana 12/12, which frankly isn't too bad. I mean, we've seen other 8-mana just big-bodied threats before, but never quite this big from a raw stat line. So against some decks, you might be fine just playing an empty board 8-mana 12/12. But also, Deathwing can serve as a solid single target removal card, particularly anything with like high health and low attack. Deathwing's going to take some really favorable trades into those sorts of minions, retaining a threat on board, often like a 12/6 or something at the very least, right? Like that's still something to deal with and a really nice swing card compared to like, I don't know, Firelands Portal at 7 mana, right? Like deal 5 and get a 5-drop. Deathwing's going to be better than that. Now he is 8 mana, but he's going to be way better than that in a lot of cases. If your opponent only has 1 minion on board, he's going to trade into much bigger things and leave behind a bigger body, which is nice. And then finally, Deathwing can just be a full board clear sometimes. Your opponent has like 4 or 5 small minions out there. Deathwing's going to line up as a twisting nether of sorts, and you might just be really happy to have another twisting nether in your deck that has some additional upside and flexibility, because he can be other things as well. And when you break down the 3 different ways you can play this Deathwing card, I think it just makes sense. It doesn't have to be a Dragon Warrior either. It can just be any kind of control warrior, maybe even an aggro deck top-end card is the final kind of threat or puzzle piece there. I don't know, Deathwing seems to have that flexibility. So for me, Warrior's a class that's found a ton of success. Deathwing makes a ton of sense, and that's why he's in my top 3. So moving on to number 2 here, we have the Malygos Aspect of Magic for Mage, and Malygos is going to give you an upgraded Mage spell at this point. Hopefully you're familiar with what those are, but they're just like discounted spells or spells with extra stats on their effects, like 8 damage fireballs, for instance. And it turns out they're pretty good. After having seen this played and playing a little bit, the spells feel really good. And for 5 mana, Malygos feels quite nice too. Like, you just get him down, you get a nice spell. Even if you're at 10 mana, you can do a lot of things. With Malygos, just playing him on curve on 5 and predicting what you might need seems like a powerful asset as well. There's damage, there's removal, there's AoE, there's all this stuff in the pool for Malygos. And all the spells feel like winners, and often you're likely to find the sort of thing that you need. It's hard to like whiff completely with Malygos, so quite a bit of consistency there as well, thanks to the Discover effect. And of course, he seems to just fit really well into things like Highlander Mage, a deck that we've seen already find success. It complements dragons really nicely too, and there's some new dragon synergy cards. So Malygos just feels like a powerful card that's a good fit in a strong archetype, and I think it's almost inevitable that this card sees some degree of play And that inevitability, certainly in my mind, earns a top 2 spot. And then finally, for the number 1 spot, Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, our new Highlander support card here. She's going to give you 2 dragons in your hand. They're going to cost 0, and frankly, I think that's going to be amazing. My first take on this card was positive, and then I thought a lot about it, and still pretty high on it, but I had some concerns that it might just feel too slow, like it's hard to commit 9 mana to a turn, and maybe, you know, it's just sitting there and you're kind of passive with it. It's just a threat, but your opponent just slams you in the face a bunch, and Dragon Queen Alexstrasza didn't do anything. But after having played this card and having it played against me a fair bit in the Theory Crafting live streams, I'm confident Dragon Queen Alexstrasza is gonna be nuts. I didn't really have any instances where it totally whiffed. I always felt pretty good about the results. And if you're ahead at all, Dragon Queen Alexstrasza creates so much pressure. It's really hard for most decks to recover from that. And even sometimes when you're behind, she's fine because there's a lot of dragons that do defensive things. They have taunt. They have battle cries that matter. So yeah, Dragon Queen Alexstrasza is just nutty, and I'm sure she's gonna find at least a couple good Highlander decks. She's got some dragon synergies as well to take advantage of course, like every card in this video. So a ton of flexibility, really high power level, across multiple archetypes and decks because she's a neutral card. So all in all, I think you kind of have to put Dragon Queen Alexstrasza at the number 1 spot. I think this will be the best legendary dragon from Descent of Dragons. And there you go, folks. That is it. Those are my rankings. To be honest with you, like the first 6 spots, I can almost shuffle in any order. I think they're all like 3-star cards basically at this stage. I mean, I may not have rated them that originally, but my current interpretations of those are all like 3-star cards. So take those and do what you want with those first, 5, 6 spots. The top 3 or 4 I feel pretty good about, and I'm confident those will kind of rise above the rest a little bit, maybe just the top 3. But I'm really curious to hear your interpretations, because obviously, given how close a lot of these cards are, I think we could all have drastically different lists. And that's fun to hear and fun to see. So share your thoughts on that in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, you like these kinds of lists and discussion videos, I do a ton of these on the channel. So please drop that subscribe if you enjoy these and you want to see more. We're pushing to 100,000, folks. All that said, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.